Well, this is BBC News, and we are continuing to get reaction and responses and reflections from world leaders right around the world to the death of Pope Francis after the Vatican announced the news that he has died at the age of 88. I want to bring you now, via our senior royal correspondent, a quote from His Majesty the King. The message is this. My wife and I were most deeply saddened to learn of the death of Pope Francis. Our heavy hearts have been somewhat eased, however, to know that His Holiness was able to share an Easter greeting with the Church and the world he served with such devotion throughout his life and ministry. His Holiness will be remembered for his compassion, his concern for the unity of the Church, and for his tireless commitment to the common causes of all people of faith, and to those goodwill who work for the benefit of others. His belief that care for creation is an existential expression of faith in God resounded with so many people across the world. Through his work and care for both people and planet, he profoundly touched the lives of so many. The Queen and I remember with particular affection our meeting with His Holiness over the years, and we were greatly moved to have been able to visit him earlier in the month. We send our most heartfelt condolences and profound sympathy to the Church he served with such resolve, and to the countless people around the world who, inspired by his life, will be mourning the devastating loss of this faithful follower of Jesus Christ. So that statement just in the last few minutes from the King. I just want to return now to David Willey, with BBC's Vatican correspondent for 40 years, and we had a response there from the King echoing so many of the reflections and words by world leaders around the world.
Indeed, he was a figure who was admired and esteemed by many countries. Everybody he came into contact with felt they got some special strength from a visit to the Vatican. And I thought it was very interesting that at the last minute, he has received two very important visitors at the Vatican. That's to say, the King and Queen during their recent state visit to Italy, and even Vice President Vance, who managed to squeeze in a quick greeting to the Pope, actually the very day before he died on Easter Sunday, yesterday, before we heard early this morning about his death in the early hours of the morning. I think Pope Francis I shall remember most as a man who was prepared to break boundaries, but he realized that the Catholic Church was suffering, both from a split between those who wanted reforms to take place and those who thought that for a church which has been accustomed to speak in centuries rather than in 4-year terms, like politicians, international politicians, and secular leaders, in the space of only 10 years, he's managed to turn around, I think, quite a lot of doctrine in the Church without actually making any world-shaking changes to Catholic doctrine. I thought one of his most significant statements was some years ago when he was embroiled in the question of the scandals involving church dignitaries and many bishops and cardinals. He simply said, listen, who am I to judge? He was not judgmental. He tried to mediate. He tried to bring the church into a more modern frame of mind, and indeed used modern technology for the first time. The church has now got a big website operating. It has adopted modern technology in the way it spreads the gospel message. The church survived the COVID period when the Vatican was virtually deserted, and many people here in Italy never even went to church because it was forbidden. The church services were stopped. I think the COVID epidemic worldwide caused immense damage to the church because many people who had been regular mass goers previously and Catholic countries perhaps failed to return to church in the numbers that we were accustomed to before. But certainly, by going to the far ends of the earth to preach his gospel message, and by visiting members of his flock, even, for example, in Mongolia, where there is a Catholic priest is now the local church leader, he's been promoted to cardinal, and there is less than 1% of the population is Catholic. He thought there was a role for the Catholic Church to play worldwide. And I think we're going to see the implications of this in the upcoming conclave, which will elect a successor to Pope Francis. Another very interesting fact I think we're going to notice in the days to come is that the Pope simplified the ritual for a papal funeral. He didn't want the massive funeral of a prince of the church. He's already chosen where he wants to be buried, not inside the Vatican, but here in a Roman basilica, not far from here. And he really wants to show, I think, that the church can adapt to the modern world without becoming corrupted by the temptations of the modern world, and particularly the political temptations. He's known how to keep the church away from politics, but into morals, which of course is where it counts.
David Willey, thank you very much for your reflections, former BBC Vatican correspondent. Well, we are keeping across all the different developments and reaction around the world. Of course, this is being felt so keenly in Vatican and in Italy. We've had some reaction out of Italy. There were due to be 4 scheduled matches in the top flight of Italian football, Serie A, today on Monday. They have now been postponed following the death of Pope Francis. Just want to bring in my colleague Rich Preston, who's with us and has been monitoring reaction from world leaders and others right around the world. Rich, you can bring us up to date.
Lewis, in the last few moments we've had reaction from Russia. President Putin expressing his condolences over the death of Pope Francis and hailing him as a defender of the highest values of humanism and justice. President Putin says, "I had the privilege of communicating with this outstanding man on many occasions, and I will forever retain the fondest memory of him." And of course, in 2016, Pope Francis met the Orthodox Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, famously kissed him in a sign of bridging divides between communities, even within the church. This message from President Putin adding to the messages we've seen from other world leaders. The White House in the last half hour or so posting on X, "Rest in peace," alongside photos of President Trump and the First Lady meeting the Pope, and also J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, who met the Pope within the last couple of days and who's currently on a trip to India, and earlier said, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him."
Rich, thank you for that. Let's speak now to Tina Beattie, Professor Emerita Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton. Thank you for coming on the programme. Just want to start with getting your immediate thoughts. This news just less than 2 hours old and is spreading around the world now, and people will be given their reactions and reflections. And I just want to start with yours.
There's great sadness, of course, but I don't think this is a shock. Neither is it a tragedy when a very sick 88-year-old finds the peace of death. As Catholics, I don't think we should treat this kind of death as a shock and a tragedy. I think rather we should be immensely grateful for the wonderful leadership we've had from Pope Francis since 2013, and pray for him to rest in peace and rise in glory, and also bear in mind that we're now entering a time of deep uncertainty in the Church. So also our prayers for what happens next. But personally, I think, if I'm honest, I feel a sense of relief, because we saw when Pope John Paul II died, the sort of grueling process of an increasingly incapacitated Pope dying very slowly, also interestingly at Easter. And it was obvious in the last few weeks that Pope Francis was very ill, he had a tremendous dedication to duty and to all the peoples of the world, and tried so heroically to continue to show that right up until the end. But he's now at peace, and I just feel immense gratitude for all that he gave to the church, and a sense of relief for him that peace has come.
And of course, he faced challenges, as all popes do, and failures. What do you make of his time? He became pope in his 70s, back in 2013. How do you try and assess the successes and failures?
I think he was a breath of fresh air. We'd had two fairly authoritarian papacies, and it would be wrong to describe him as progressive or liberal. These are political labels that don't map neatly onto leaders of the Catholic Church, but he certainly brought about a more pastorally sensitive and compassionate ethos in the church. He put the environment at the very top of his concerns, along with refugees and people who are marginalised by the present world order. He was an outspoken critic of neoliberalism, of the impact of global economics on the world's poorest and most marginalised. And in all this, I think he opened the doors of compassion and tenderness and a certain kind of pragmatism about the struggles of people's everyday lives, as opposed to perhaps strict doctrinal adherence to some of the church's rules. All this, I think, were very welcome to many of us. As a woman, I wish he'd done more of substance for women in the church. He did his best to promote women to more visible positions of leadership. He gave some women votes at the recent synods held in the Vatican. All this is good, but there were no substantial changes that can't be undone by a more authoritarian successor. And I think that is a regret for women like me. He could be quite stubborn. He could be quite romantic about women. But, you know, today is a day, I think, for being thankful for his legacy. It's also interesting that in his vocal criticisms of the global world order, he met J.D. Vance yesterday in a private meeting, very brief. But in February, he wrote a letter to the American bishops pointing out the wrongness of mass deportations. He was a passionate campaigner for social justice, particularly on behalf of refugees. And it was an unusually political letter. Popes don't intervene in party politics or national politics, but it was clear that he had J.D. Vance in his sights when he clarified a church teaching known as Ordo Amoris, the order of love, which Vance had tried to argue was about looking after our family, our neighbours, our community, our nation, and in a way the implication was if there's anything left, which there probably isn't, we might look further afield. And Pope Francis intervened on that. There was a little spat in social media between Rory Stewart and J.D. Vance over it. And without naming anyone, Pope Francis, in that letter to the American bishops, made very clear that the teaching known as Ordo Amoris is not about a hierarchy of love. It's about an inclusive love from which nobody is accepted and except left out. And he was very clear that this particularly referred to those who are marginalised, impoverished and exploited by the global economic order. So he was no friend of far-right politics. But yes, as I say, I just think that it's a time to be thankful for what he gave the church and to hope that his legacy continues. But, you know, the Catholic Church has a long and messy history. It survives crises, it survives good popes and bad popes, and whatever happens, it will trundle on through whoever the next pope is. But at a time of growing global crisis and security, environmental catastrophe, we really do need someone who will continue Pope Francis's vision, I think.
Tina Beattie, thank you very much for your thoughts and analysis. Thank you. Just want to bring you the statement we've just had through from Keir Starmer, Prime Minister. I join millions around the world in grieving the death of His Holiness Pope Francis. His leadership in a complex and challenging time for the world and the church was courageous. It always came from a place of deep humility. Pope Francis was a pope for the poor, the downtrodden and the forgotten. He was close to the realities of human fragility, meeting Christians around the world facing war, famine, persecution and poverty. Yet he never lost hope of a better world. That hope was at the heart of his papacy. His determination to visibly live out his faith inspired people across the world to see afresh the Church's teachings of mercy and charity. With his death, we are reminded once more of his call to care for one another across different faiths, backgrounds, nations and beliefs. My thoughts are with Catholics across the world and the Roman Catholic Church. May His Holiness rest in peace. So those comments just in the last few minutes from the Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Let's cross now to Sofia Petitsa, who's our reporter there in St. Peter's Square. And the bells, I believe, are ringing. Let's just cross live and take a listen.
Well, that's right, Lewis. In the last few seconds, the bells in St. Peter's Church have been ringing to announce the death of Pope Francis. Let's just take a listen. You might be able to hear them. It's a crowd of hundreds of people here, all silent. And it's a mix of Italians and people from all over the world that have come here to pay their respects for Pope Francis. The Pope, of course, was just here yesterday to deliver a brief address for Easter Sunday, one of the most important days in the Catholic Church for a Pope. And there's been, throughout the morning, hundreds of thousands of people pouring in here in St. Peter's Square. We spoke to people from India, from South Africa, from Italy, from Denmark, who have all told us that they wanted to come here to pay respects one more time. And I think you can still hear the bells ringing behind me. Let's take another listen. You might be able to see as well, if we pan out, people around me. And I would say that the feeling here, there's an overwhelming feeling of shock. Yes, Pope Francis had been unwell. He was in poor health for the last few months. But after he appeared just behind me yesterday in St. Peter's Square, there had been a bit of hope among Catholics that he was on his way to recovery. And of course, this morning, the news about his death would have come as a shock to lots of people within the Catholic Church and beyond. Lewis.
Sophia, thank you very much for that. Sophia Petitsa live there, giving us a sense of the emotion and the mood there in the square as those bells poignantly ring out for the death of Pope Francis, died at the age of 88. And there have been reflections, of course, there in Vatican City, across Italy, Europe, and right around the world. He was a global figure, of course, when he visited more than 60 countries during his time as Pope, and a Pope of many firsts as well. The first from Latin America, first Jesuit priest to be named a Pope, and the first to be born and raised outside of Europe even since the 8th century. So this news really is a global event, and he is a global figure, of course. So spiritually significant for so many Catholics, Christians across the world. There are 1.3 billion Roman Catholics worldwide, is the latest estimate. But of course, he was a global figure beyond that. Many people warmed to him and his causes, and certainly people knew about him and his work right around the world. Let's go next to our reporter, Sam Harrison, who is at Westminster Cathedral here in London. And Sam, we just saw the bells ringing out and heard them there in Vatican City. Plenty of poignant emotion and people pausing to reflect there. And I'm sure they'll be doing the same in cities like London right around the world.
Good morning. Yes, I'm here at Westminster Cathedral, which is the largest Roman Catholic church in England and Wales. There's a service that will take place shortly just behind me. The doors are open, a few people still making their way in there now. It is a beautiful church. Many people who are watching may have been inside the church here. It is a fantastic spectacle to behold, and today it's become a focal point for Catholics here in London to meet, to come together, to reflect on the fact that Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. We've been speaking to people from all over the world here, as you've been hearing all morning. This is a Pope that had such an international outreach. We spoke to one lady this morning from Argentina. She's visiting in London, and she spoke of the sorrow that her nation is going to feel at this news. And another thing that has become clear this morning, having spoken to a few people here, is that this is a Pope who many people regarded as someone who outreached to areas of society who were perhaps seen as castaways, impoverished parts of populations across the globe. He made it his mission to reach out to those types of people in society. And he was a truly international figure. We've seen over the last couple of decades a trend in the Vatican to reach beyond Italy when it looks to appointing a pope after conclave. Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict coming from Poland and Germany respectively, but to go from a German pope to a South American pope to an Argentinian pope was a massive move and signalled a huge shift in international Catholicism, which you feel here this morning. People from all sorts of nationalities have been speaking to us today. Some of them have gone into Westminster Cathedral behind me to take part in today's service. And another poignant reminder, I think, that people have alluded to this morning is the fact that he has opened up the church to so many new corners of the globe. Look at the potential new candidates who might come forward for the papacy in the future. A candidate from the Philippines, several candidates from the United States. This is largely thanks to the fact that Pope Francis was an outward character, a character who took on a huge amount of international travel in a globalized world. You feel that here this morning. You feel the outreach that he accomplished during his time as Pope, and many people here say he will be sadly missed.
And Sam, just remind us, you mentioned right at the beginning there a service due to be getting underway. Do you know any details? Do we have any details of that?
Well, this is just a typical Easter Monday service that would usually be taking place on this day anyway. It was due to start at 11 o'clock through those doors just behind me. So a lot of people were here for that service anyway. Surprisingly, because of the nature of this breaking news, some people were finding out as they went into the church service here this morning, which, when you think about such a symbolic moment in Catholicism worldwide, to find out on Easter Monday as you're going to attend an Easter Monday service is quite remarkable, and it has been met with such sorrow here. And we've been speaking to people who've gathered here at Westminster Cathedral who are from around the world, and this loss will be felt in all corners of the globe.
Sam, thank you very much for that. I'm going to cross now to David Willey, who was the BBC's Vatican correspondent for 40 years, author of a number of papal biographies. Hello again. We were chatting just in the last hour, and we started to touch on some of the challenges that he faced during his time. And we have a moment now just to explore that a little further. Of course, when he took over, this was 2013, church under attack and had been under attack for a while over child sex abuse scandals, numerous and widespread, and still, this many years on, many people feeling still not enough done there.
Well, Pope Francis did actually set up a committee to examine the terrible cases of priestly abuse of children, which had occurred, some of them to his knowledge, many of them not to his knowledge. And I remember well that the Vatican's attitude during the Pope Benedict's reign and John Paul's reign was that, yes, well, there were these unfortunate cases of priests abusing children, but in fact, this was basically an American problem. Well, guess what? It turned out to be a worldwide problem. And under Pope Francis, we've seen bishops' conferences all over the world, Catholic bishops' conferences, trying to deal with what came to be seen as a worldwide problem. The abuse of children by priests in the Catholic Church, and I think many people felt that that Pope Francis, although he made some gestures and set up this committee, didn't do enough to stem this great problem, which has been revealed in recent decades, and that the Church still has some way to go in order to address effectively.
And some of the other challenges he faced that constant balance between more progressive elements within the church and more conservative elements, and would get it in the neck from both sides. And I suppose that's almost inevitable. But what do you make of the way he tried to straddle and balance that?
Well, as I said before, I think one of his most pregnant statements was when he asked to comment on the problems facing priestly celibacy and so on. Said, "Well, who am I to judge?" He didn't want to make a final judgment. He held fast to traditional Catholic doctrine. He made it clear that under his leadership, the Church was not going to allow women priests, for example. But he left open, I think, many issues which his successor is going to have to tackle. And I remember when I was looking for a title for my book about Pope Francis, I chose the title "The Challenge of Change." Well, the challenge of change is still open, and whoever succeeds Pope Francis is going to have to deal with the same old problems on a global scale. That, I think, is the problem. The strength of the Catholic Church in dealing with such weighty problems is that it has a long tradition and does think over a very long period. It is not committed to 4-year political terms for political leaders. It's committed to a papacy which is of unknown duration. During my time here living in Rome, I've had one papacy which lasted only just over a month, and another which lasted for 26 years. So there's a lot of variability in how long a pope is going to be granted life in order to carry out reforms. But certainly, I think one of the considerations that the cardinals are going to have in their mind when they come to elect a successor to Pope Francis is that they don't want to elect a man who is too old to run one of the most difficult and consuming jobs that can exist in the world. You need a man who is still able to offer a good number of years of his life to dealing with this difficult task.
And on the way that he tried to sum up, encapsulate his time, he talked about wanting a poor church for the poor, this emphasis on humility and simplicity and fighting for the underprivileged, underserved, underrepresented. Do you think when people do reflect on his time, that is what will come to mind?
Yes, I think he's going to be remembered as somebody who did broaden the reach of the Catholic Church in an unexpected and hitherto unrealized way. Because when you think of the way in which, in recent history, at least over the past few centuries, it has been Europeans who've run the church, not people from the United States or from Latin America or let alone from Africa. But of course, one of the interesting points that there obviously is going to be a lot of speculation in the weeks to come is to what extent the church would accept a new pope from one of the continents which has so far been unrepresented for the leadership of the church in Rome, namely Africa or Asia. There are some cardinals in both continents who are considered papabile, that's to say, they are considered possible candidates for the papacy. And it'll be very interesting to see when the cardinals meet in Rome what weight the cardinals from the rest of the world are going to show in their ability to take over the leadership of what is, after all, a worldwide organization and no longer one that is maybe run just from the tiny Vatican City state here in Rome, but has worldwide implications. I think also what's been very striking this morning is the immediate reaction from heads of state all over the world to the death of the Pope. He clearly was somebody who struck a chord in the hearts of world leaders, be they President Putin or Vice President Vance, a recent Catholic convert, who was privileged with seeing the Pope just a day before he died here at the Vatican yesterday, Easter Sunday.
David, thank you very much for that. This is BBC News. We have continuing coverage here reflecting on the death of Pope Francis. The Vatican announced that he died this morning at the age of 88. Just want to let you know what is coming up here. With me in the studio, we have Rich Preston, who is bringing us all the latest reaction from around the world. We'll come to Rich in just a moment. Jorge Perez from BBC Mundo is here. I want to reflect for a moment with you, Jorge, on the fact that this was a Pope of firsts, as we've been saying quite a bit over the last couple of hours, the first from Latin America. What is the significance of that?
Quite important for the region. I mean, it's in the world, in the Catholic world, this is the place where most Catholics are living today and still live today, despite of recent years of declining in that number. A reference in 1995, 80% of the Catholics of people in Latin America identified as Catholics. It has been declining sharply. Now 54% of Latin Americans identify themselves as Catholics. So it's not a coincidence that he was chosen the leader of the Catholic Church for this region in particular. It's important because his message of inclusion, his message to help the poor, of course, reflects what the region is. It's a region affected by huge inequality, and his message, let's say, kept him quite popular despite some slight decline in that popularity in recent years.
And some of the criticism that he faced, well, he would face criticism, of course, almost inevitably if you make changes in social issues within the Catholic Church, issues like women, homosexuality, you will inevitably face criticism for either doing too much or not doing enough. What were the general perceptions across the region about his views on those more social issues?
There are like two faces when you see Pope Francis from Latin America. Of course, this leader from the church, the main religious institution in the region, talking about helping the most favorable ones. But also, you also have Pope Francis that was against abortion rights, for example, that was against anti-conception methods, and it's a topic in the region. It's a continent that has been trying to make some progress in these rights for women. Of course, when you have the leader of the main religion in the region opposing to this, it's going to cause some controversy, or at least some reactions from people that are trying to advance in this matter. So for some a hero, maybe someone who was championing for the poor, but for others, especially conservative leaders also. There was this multiple reaction towards his image and his figure in the region.
I'll come back in just one moment. Rich, just want to come to you because I know you've been keeping across that reaction right around the world. What is the latest?
That's right, Lewis. And another part of the world where Catholicism is an important religion, important part of the national makeup is the Philippines. In the last few moments, President Marcos there expressing his deep sorrow over the passing of Pope Francis in a post on social media saying, "I love this Pope, the best Pope in my lifetime as far as I'm concerned." We've also recently heard from President Zelensky of Ukraine, who says, "I'm grieving for Pope Francis, who prayed for peace in Ukraine." And this comes after comments from Moscow. President Putin saying he was sending his condolences to the wider Catholic community and that Pope Francis worked hard to try and join the bridges there between the Russian Orthodox Church and also between the Catholic Church.
Rich, thank you for that. Jorge, I just want to come back to you. This idea of being the first from your region, of course, is significant and interesting, but it needs then to be backed up effectively with delivery of some sort to maintain that level of popularity. Was that central message of his of fighting for the poor one that resonated so strongly that that kept his popularity within the region, or did it ebb?
Somehow it did, but it's also, we also have to take into consideration certain concerns about the relationship between the Catholic Church in Latin America and the people over there, and what actually affected the popularity not only of Pope Francis, but of the religion itself, of the Church, the Catholic Church. We're talking about two main issues here: corruption among some Catholic religion institutions in Latin America, and scandals of sex abuse committed by some Catholic priests in the region, and how the Church managed to contain this crisis within a region that is still highly Catholic mainly. So the message of helping the poor, of course, kept him quite popular. Still today, Pope Francis, before he passed away, he remained quite popular, actually more popular than some local leaders in the region. But of course, it seems that his death came without, for the Church, solving these two main issues I'm mentioning. How is the Church gonna finally end up this situation with scandals, sex abuse scandals within its institution, and how it's gonna solve also the problem of corruption within some episcopal conferences or other religious institutions related to the Catholic Church in the region.
Thank you very much for giving us the view from his home region. Rich, thank you too for the latest. Let's cross live now to Sofia Petitza, who's our reporter in Rome. Sofia, just talk us through what's happening there now.
Well, Luis, the atmosphere here is one of palpable shock. Just a few minutes ago here in St. Peter's Square, we heard the bells of the Basilica ringing for a few minutes, announcing the death of Pope Francis. And let me tell you, there are thousands of people that are gathering here in the square, and mostly they fell silent for several minutes. So it felt like a very significant moment. Now, we've been here, we've been speaking to people who have come to pay their respects from Italy, from Denmark, from South Africa, from India. And we can speak to somebody who's come here from Spain. Maria, hola.
Hi.
Hello. How did you react when you heard about the news about Pope Francis?
To be honest, we are all really shocked this morning as we hear the news coming. And we are really sad for this news because I think it's a bad loss for the church. But we are all really grateful for being here and see what's going on. And I want to be thankful for all the messages the Pope has given to us throughout all these years, especially to young people. and those messages has encouraged us to continue believing in God and all his thoughts.
So do you think Pope Francis was able to reach out to younger Catholics as well?
Yes, obviously. He has always tried to encourage us all the beliefs and values of the Church, especially here in Europe, well, obviously around the world, worldwide. And I think it has been very useful for us.
And how do you feel today, the atmosphere here in St. Peter's Square? Did you come here to pay your respects?
Well, obviously I want to transmit our respect for all the people who are here, but also to show the world that we are here even though he's not here, he's with God. So I know he's looking at us from the sky, from heaven, and I'm sure he's very proud of us.
Finally, what is the thing that you will remember the most when you think about Pope Francis and his legacy?
Well, as I've said before, all the messages and the quotes he has told us, that he has always tried to be in every place, in every country, and that's really nice.
Maria, thank you so much for speaking to us. Thank you. Well, that's something that we've heard time and again from people here this morning, the fact that Pope Francis really tried to make the Catholic Church more inclusive, whether that's his messages towards divorced couples or towards LGBTQ plus people. And now, of course, that this is just a sense of what's happening here at the Vatican. There will be more reaction, more activity in the days and in the weeks to come. But I think for now, people here in St. Peter's Square this morning are, just absorbing the news, really, and reflecting on the life of Pope Francis. Lewis.
Sophia, thank you very much for that. Cross back to you a little later on. A new line that has come to us from the AFP news agency from Spain. Spain declares 3 days of mourning for the late Pope. So 3 days of national mourning declared honour of Pope Francis, who's died at the age of 88. This is the continuous coverage we are bringing you here at the BBC. The news came about 2.5 hours ago, confirming from the Vatican that he died at 7:35 this morning, Easter Monday. Just want to bring you now the moment of that announcement from the Vatican. The announcement of the Pope's death was made by Cardinal Kevin Farrell.
Dear brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and His Church. He taught us to live the values of the Gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially towards the poorest and most marginalised. With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite merciful love of the triune God.
Now, our religion editor, Aline McBull, looks back at the life of Pope Francis.
His surprise election in 2013 would mark a more radical break with the past than many expected. Jorge Bergoglio did have Italian roots, but was born in Argentina. While studying for priesthood, he worked briefly as a nightclub bouncer. While many fellow Jesuits were jailed and tortured during Argentina's military dictatorship, he rose to become Archbishop of Buenos Aires, some accusing him of forging too close a relationship with the regime. As Pope, he greeted his flock, having taken the name of a saint who championed the cause of the poor. Francis signalled that his pontificate would be rooted not in Rome, but in the lives of believers around the world, and especially those on the economic margins. His style was informal, even when conducting ceremonies, and his first act as Pope was to pay his own hotel bill. In his early gestures, like washing the feet of the elderly and prisoners, he showed desire for his priests to be closer to the disadvantaged. He spoke out for the protection of migrants and refugees, laying a wreath on the waters where so many died on their perilous journeys. He travelled widely, drawing energy from the crowds. In Brazil, 3 million gathered on Copacabana Beach. And in the Philippines, he broke records for the world's largest mass, as 6 million turned out to join him. He linked economic inequality to the environment. In a video launching a papal encyclical, he said climate change amounted to rich countries inflicting damage on poor ones.
The Pope of the Holy See!
In 2015, he became the first pope to address the US Congress.
I am most grateful for your invitation,
telling the world's richest nation to take care of Mother Earth.
God bless America.
He apologized for the scandal of sexual abuse of children by priests. His words here spoken by a translator.
God weeps for the sexual abuse of children.
On a visit to Ireland, the first by a pope in almost 40 years, he apologized to victims at almost every event, but scandals continued to emerge. His papacy marked something of a change of tone on the subject of homosexuality, early on remarking, "Who am I to judge?" when talking about a gay bishop. But some progressives argue that in practical terms, the Vatican's stance and the Church's teachings have changed little. Even so, conservative Catholics viewed him with suspicion. But in some ways, he was as traditional as Pope John Paul II, whom he made a saint. And he had very conservative views on abortion, contraception, surrogacy, and gender reassignment. His style of papacy, though, couldn't have been more different to his immediate predecessor, Benedict XVI, whose funeral he presided over. Through the scores of cardinals from the developing world he appointed, he changed the complexion of the church hierarchy, consolidating a shift in the centre of gravity of Catholicism away from Europe, where it was in decline, toward Latin America, Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. In recent years, Pope Francis was beset by health issues, most noticeably affecting his mobility, but he found it hard to pare down his busy schedule.
Buona domenica a tutti.
He was, above all, a pastoral pope, a man of humility who preferred the fellowship of ordinary believers to the trappings of ecclesiastical status and power.
That was our religion editor there, Aline McBall, reflecting on the life of Pope Francis after the Vatican confirming just a few hours ago the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88. He died at just gone 7:30 this morning in the Vatican. He was seen over the weekend, Easter weekend, of course, in the Vatican, wishing a happy Easter to people there and meeting the crowds, which led many to hold some hope, optimism as to his health. But of course, his health had been in a pretty poor state for many weeks and months, spending those weeks in hospital before coming back to the Vatican City. He was only on light duties, effectively, with no big scheduled set pieces. He did make unscheduled appearances, like he did over the weekend, to say Happy Easter. But then the news coming this morning from the Vatican. We here on BBC News are continuing our special coverage. I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones, and I just want to bring you now some of the latest updates and the latest reaction that we have. So first of all, let's just take a look at these images of the British Embassy to the Vatican lowering their flag to half-mast to mourn the death of Pope Francis. This custom is observed until the 9th day of mourning. So they are just some of the latest pictures we have. And to bring you up to date with me In the studio here is Rich Preston, who is keeping across all the latest reaction and developments for us, and Jorge Perez from BBC Mundo from The View from Latin America in just a moment. Rich, we just saw the flag being lowered there to half-mast. What are some of the other reaction around the world now?
Well, Lewis, the same is happening in Austria. Church bells ringing across the country there at 4 o'clock UK time later today in memory of Pope Francis, and black flags being hung on churches and clerical buildings in Austria. A Requiem Mass will be held for the Pope in Vienna later on today. That coming to us from our correspondent there. In France today, the Eiffel Tower will go dark this evening in memory of Pope Francis. Staying in Paris, the bells of Notre Dame Cathedral rang out 88 times earlier today, one ring for each year of the Pope's life, and there will also be a special memorial mass there. Spain, you mentioned this earlier, Lewis, has declared 3 days of national mourning to honour Pope Francis. And there has also been a special memorial mass announced that will be held at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is, of course, a vitally important site in the Christian community.
Rich, thank you for that. Jorge, if we just come to you, of course, this was a Pope of firsts, as I mentioned, and will be mentioned quite a lot now in the days ahead, because one of the first, the Pope from Latin America, a hugely significant figure in the region. Just talk us through, in practice, how it played out. What was the significance, what he achieved?
Of course, being a Latin American Pope meant that he was keen to the problems of the region and to the political context. For example, we saw him between 2014 and 2015 mediating between the United States and Cuba, trying to make that relationship better, and actually somehow he achieved that until President Donald Trump was elected in the first time. All those changes and mediation that took place that meant that the United States, for example, reopened its embassy in La Habana. All that was reversed when Donald Trump was in his first term. But we can also talk about, for example, the peace dialogues between the Colombian government and the far left guerrilla, Las FARC, in Colombia. The Catholic Church under Pope Francis also took an important role mediating between both parts. Quite popular among those that saw him as someone who was representing the majority of a region where most of the people are poor, but also having some conflicts between conservative sectors. He traveled 10 times to the region, never traveled to Argentina, something that calls the attention to many people over there. Apparently he didn't want to mess up with the internal political situation from his position as a leader of the Catholic Church. But we are seeing the reactions just started to take place right now. It's very early in the morning right now in Latin America. Argentina, one of the first countries to react. Already President Milei reacted to his death, the first country, saying that he deeply sorrows what happened with Pope, with whom he had minor differences today. And we are expecting to hear more from other leaders in Latin America.
Jorge, thank you very much for the moment. We're going to speak now to Gerard O'Connell, who's America Magazine's Vatican correspondent, author of The Election of Pope Francis, an inside story, the conclave that changed history. Thank you for coming on the programme. Well, that title there, Changed History, kind of tees us up, really. How do you try and put this figure in a kind of historical context?
Well, he was, as your previous speaker said, the first pope from outside of Europe, outside of from the New World, from Latin America. He came with a different mindset. He had never studied in Rome. He spent very little in Rome. He was not Europe-formed mindset. And so he brought a whole new freshness, the freshness that you see in the Latin American churches, to Rome, to the Vatican, and to the Universal Church. And he also brought an approach reaching out to people everywhere. He said before he was elected, in his speech to the cardinals before he was elected, he said, we've we've got to look out. We've got to reach out. And that's exactly what he did. He spent his life reaching out to people of all kinds, and first and foremost to the poor and to the discarded. I think he's put the church on a path that it will be very difficult for a successor to diverge much from.
Interesting. We will come back to some of those values that drove him and whether how resilient they will be now that he has gone. I just want to take you back to 2013 when he became Pope. He was in his 70s, and the Pope it was seen as a moment of change then. But of course, what he inherited, not least the child sex abuse scandals at the time and still continue now. How do you feel his handling of that will be remembered?
Well, he was on a learning curve because he hadn't understood the vastness of the problem. He had seen some instances of it. Remember, it was less public, if we will say this, in Latin America at that time. Then he suddenly began to see the dimensions, the global dimensions of the problems, and he blamed a lot of it on clericalism and on the way the priests were being trained and the lack of sensitivity. And in fact, he brought into one of the Vatican commissions one of the victims of abuse by priests in Chile. He became a very close friend of his, Juan Carlos Cruz, a gay man who really suffered greatly in Chile. He also brought several people, one from England, one from Ireland, onto the commission for those who survived the abuse. And I think in these 12 years, he was now really in his 13th year, he changed dramatically the stance of the church towards the abuse question. He made it a possibility to remove from office a bishop who did not act when abuse was denounced. So I think he himself realized there was still much to do. He said this not very long ago, but he had put the Catholic Church on a track to safeguard children in all its institutions. And I think history will be much kinder to him than some of his critics today.
Interesting. We will pick up on some of the other challenges he faced. I just want you, if you can, just to stand by. Just want to bring this piece of news that we are just receiving, and it's just an update from the Vatican. And the Vatican have just communicated this. This evening, Monday, April the 21st at 8 p.m. local time, Cardinal Kevin Joseph Farrell will preside over the rite of the declaration of death and the placing of the body in the coffin. So just want to repeat that update we're getting from our colleagues that the Vatican has just communicated this. This evening, Monday, April the 21st at 8 p.m. local time, Cardinal Kevin Joseph Farrell will preside over the rite of the declaration of death and the placing of the body in the coffin. Jared, if we just return to you, just first of all, any thoughts on that and actually the process that will now unfold?
Well, normally Francis, like he did with so many things, he simplified the funeral rite for popes. He said they have to have a funeral similar to that of the ordinary Christian. So in the past, there were 3 types of coffins into which the pope was put. Francis reduced this to 1. And he didn't want his body to be put on a catafalque in the basilica. He wanted to be simply laid in the coffin and for people to come and pay their respects there. The funeral, I think, they haven't yet announced, but it's usually about 4 to 6 days after the announcement of the death. So probably for this coming weekend. We don't have, I am speculating here, we don't have definite dates. But, you know, I saw him yesterday in St. Peter's Square. I saw him very close up. And I really felt when he went around in the Jeep around St. Peter's Square, I felt deeply that he was saying goodbye to the people. he had always wanted to be close to the people. From his first day as a Jesuit, from his day as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and from his very first moments as Pope, he wanted to be close to the people. And he concluded his life in that extraordinary drive around St. Peter's Square and down the Via della Conciliazione, that's the street in front of St. Peter's Square. He drove, and he was really looked as if he was saying goodbye to the people. He had a sadness in his face, in my estimation, and I saw him pretty close up. Maybe he saw the end was coming, we don't know. But I had the sensation then that it would not be long before he went, as the Vatican says, to the house of the Father.
Gerard, just lastly, if you could, just try and sum up the man, I suppose, the man himself. Many will know him around the world from the smile on his face, visiting world leaders and doing the travelling. How would you try and put into words the man rather than the role?
He was an extraordinary, humble, loyal man. I knew him for 20 years. And he was very concerned about the individual person. He never put himself above anybody, not even the most seriously ill person. He tried to reach the level of the person he was with. And we saw that right at the end. He did not try to hide his weaknesses or indeed his physical decline, as we saw yesterday. He was an inspiring person. He was one who really lived what the gospel calls a follower of Christ to live. And I found him an extra. He listened very carefully to what you said. He had a phenomenal memory. He was really somebody who was interested in you as a person, in your family, and he was very close to so many people in their hour of need. Even though he was world leader, he was amazingly involved in the personal lives of so many people, even as Pope. And I think this is the memory I carry with him, I carry of him, as a person who was interested in you as a person, and who was always reminded you that whatever you do wrong, God forgives you and he is open to welcome you. And I think that is where he has gone now.
Gerard O'Connell, thank you very much for your time and thank you for coming on the programme. Thank you. We can speak now to David Willey, who is BBC Vatican's correspondent for 40 years, also the author of a number of papal biographies. Just want to pick up now with some of those moments since 2013 when he became Pope, to right up to the present day, because he was still public and working right up until the weekend. What do you make of the fights that he chose to fight, the causes that he chose to champion, the values that he chose to prioritise? Which ones stand out for you and what do you think they reveal?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is his choice of the first foreign trip he made outside of Italy was to the tiny island of Lampedusa, halfway between Italy and Libya in the Mediterranean Sea, where there had been a lot of migrants from Africa had landed and on their way to try and reach another life in Europe. And this was the year of his election, and he chose to go through Lampedusa to pay tribute to all the migrants who had died at sea in small boats and so on. And I think Pope Francis had the genius of combining the very small with the very large. This is to take up again what Jerry O'Connell was just talking about when he talked about the way in which he could have a personal relationship with people, which was quite extraordinary. So although he had to deal with the huge problems of migration, of millions of people, the problems of war, of misery, of famine in Africa, the world's obvious uh, 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 problems of this moment, which are challenging not only popes but also politicians all over the world. And he found time recently, during his recent illness, every night he used to call up a small community of Catholics who live in the Gaza Strip, just across the crossing point at Erez from Gaza. When you go into, across the no man's land into Gaza, there's a little church there of Catholics, the only one still in operation in Gaza. And he got to know the parish priest, and every evening, even from his hospital bed, he used to call him up on the telephone to give him encouragement and to tell him to hang on in there. So he was able to combine this very, very personal interest in ordinary people and in members, not only clerics and members of his flock, but anybody who approached him with the great problems of the world. I think that was his genius. He remained, as Jerry O'Connell was saying, a very humble person. I think the other thing which has always amused me is the tale of when he was first elected. After a few days, Pope Francis was taken up to the papal apartments where everybody presumed that he would live, where previous popes used to live in quite splendid circumstances in staterooms, which are beautifully furnished and very ample. He looked around him at the papal apartment, which is on the top floor of the Apostolic Palace, vast, cavernous rooms. And he said, I'm not going to stay here. He turned on his feet and walked back to the guest house, where he'd been living during the conclave. And ever since, he's been living in a three-room little suite of rooms there. He had a study, a bedroom, and a bathroom, just like in any small hotel. And he's been living there very contentedly all these years, running the Vatican. Obviously, on state occasions, he uses the official reception rooms in the Vatican. But in his private life, he has shown an extreme modesty. And he showed that same modesty when he was Archbishop in Buenos Aires, because when he was elected, when he was appointed Archbishop from Rome, the first thing he did was to sell the rather splendid Archbishop's Palace in Buenos Aires. He dismissed the chauffeur, sold the limousine, and went to live in 3 rooms next door to the cathedral, a very small apartment. And at the weekend, he used to do his own cooking. So that's the sort of man he was.
And just, you touched on so much there, but I want to go back to some of those causes that he championed and that stood out for you. Of course, when you do that, inevitably, you face criticism. How do you think the criticism on whatever the issue would be, and there are plenty of social issues, moral issues, issues of deep spirituality, issues that would perhaps seen by many as veering into politics and policy, what do you make of the criticism that he would have received when he did that?
He did indeed listen very carefully when people spoke to him. That was one of the marks of his personality. He had a power of concentration, but he was also not afraid, when he had made up his own mind, to be critical himself of the cardinals in the Vatican. One of the things which struck me very, very much was every year at Christmas time he used to address the assembled cardinals in the Vatican with a sort of pep talk, and to their great surprise, after sort of giving them a normal Christmas greetings, one year I remember he laid into them in such a way they were absolutely flabbergasted. He criticized. He called them a lot of old gossips. He said, "You're behaving like old women. You don't show the qualities of church leadership that you ought to be doing. He was not afraid of trying to install in his colleagues in the Vatican the same sense of duty and of modesty that he himself had. So I would regard that as one of his crowning victories of his life, that he installed a new way of thinking in the Vatican, and that for that he's much to be admired.
David, thank you very much for that. Thank you for lending us your views and opinions and experience over the last couple of hours. Appreciate that. Just want to bring you right up to date with the developments here and with the news that we are following here on BBC News. Pope Francis has died at the age of 88, and we've started after that announcement from the Vatican to hear some more details about the next step. So just want to bring you this very brief statement from the Vatican about what does happen now. The Vatican has just communicated that this evening, Monday, April the 21st at 8 p.m. local time, Cardinal Kevin Joseph Farrell will preside over the rite of the declaration of death and the placing of the body in the coffin. So that is 8 p.m. this evening local time there in the Vatican. My colleague Rich Preston is still here with us with the latest, and Jorge Perez as well. Rich, can we come to you? Just start by bringing us up to date with the latest developments.
Well, Lewis, we've continued to see comments coming in from world leaders, including Argentina's President Javier Milei, saying it's with profound sorrow that I learned this morning that Pope Francis had passed away and is now resting in peace. He went on to say, despite differences that seem minor today, having been able to know him in his goodness and wisdom was a true honour for me. Now, when it comes to religion, the Philippines is a key country. It's the only predominantly Catholic country in Southeast Asia. And President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. there describing Pope Francis as the best pope in my lifetime, saying he was a man of profound faith and humility. Pope Francis led not only with wisdom, but with a heart open to all, especially the poor and the forgotten. Now, Pope Francis was keen to strive for peace during his tenure. Of course, one of the conflicts we've seen developing in recent years is that between Russia and Ukraine. And Ukrainian's President Volodymyr Zelensky has said today he's mourning the death of Pope Francis, saying that he had prayed for peace in Ukraine and for Ukrainians. We grieve together with Catholics and all Christians. Meanwhile, from Moscow, President Vladimir Putin offering his condolences, saying throughout the years of his pontificate, he actively promoted the development of dialogue between the Russian Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, as well as constructive cooperation between Russia and the Holy See.
Rich, thank you for that. Jorge Perez with us as well. First Pope from Latin America. Talk us through the response there in the region.
Well, we are still hearing some of the reactions. We already heard President Milei talking about his feeling of sorrow for this news. It's curious how Milei is stated, because he said, despite our minor differences with Pope Francis, he feels sorrow about this. And when he talks about minor differences, we have to remember the conflictive relationship between how Javier Milei sees the world, sees his country, Argentina, and how the Pope approaches to the people in the region, always talking in favor of the poor. Milei once said that the Pope, for example, was, in his words, the representation of the devil in the earth, which sort of contrasts with what we are listening from him today. We also heard some reactions from Brazil, other of the predominant Catholic countries in the region. And we are probably going to hear more reactions because most of Latin American countries' population are Catholic. Quite curious also the fact that Pope Francis visited many countries in the region, including Chile, Paraguay, Bolivia. These three countries are bordering bordering Argentina, but the Pope Francis never actually went there. He had a sort of complicated relationship with his country, especially, well, for different issues. One of those was the political situation within Argentina between more leftist or more conservative government. He frankly preferred to stay apart from that, and his image in the region in general, how Latin Americans see the Pope. For the conservatives, for example, he was too progressive. For some conservative Catholics in Latin America, the fact that he opened his arms to LGBTQ movement, or the fact that he was in favor of bringing the church more to the lower classes, brings some, let's say, division among conservative Catholics, but also for those who were more progressive. Today, they felt that there could have been more actions from the Catholic Church in terms of changing things in the region, in terms of, for example, abortion rights or women's rights.
Okay, thank you very much for the moment, Rich. Thank you too. This is BBC News. We are continuing our special coverage here across BBC News on the death of Pope Francis, who's died at the age of 88. I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. I want now just to bring you the latest developments and the order of what has happened and unfolded over the last few hours. Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. The Vatican announced that the Pope, the first Latin American to head the Roman Catholic Church, passed away this morning. It said his entire life had been dedicated to the service of the Lord and his Church. Well, the announcement of the Pope's death was made by Cardinal Kevin Farrell, who will preside over the conclave to elect the next Pope.
Dear brothers and sisters, with deep sorrow I must announce the death of our Holy Father Francis. At 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. His entire life was dedicated to the service of the Lord and his Church. He taught us to live the values of the Gospel with fidelity, courage, and universal love, especially towards the poorest and most marginalised. With immense gratitude for his example as a true disciple of the Lord Jesus, we commend the soul of Pope Francis to the infinite merciful love of the triune God.
So the words of that announcement came through just 3 hours or so ago, announcing that he died at 07:35, so just 90 minutes or so before that this morning. That's local time in Vatican City. And right now, our religion editor, Liam McBull, takes a look back at his life.
His surprise election in 2013 would mark a more radical break with the past than many expected. Jorge Bergoglio did have Italian roots, but was born in Argentina. While studying for priesthood, he worked briefly as a nightclub bouncer. While many fellow Jesuits were jailed and tortured during Argentina's military dictatorship, he rose to become Archbishop of Buenos Aires, some accusing him of forging too close a relationship with the regime. As Pope, he greeted his flock, having taken the name of a saint who championed the cause of the poor. Francis signalled that his pontificate would be rooted not in Rome, but in the lives of believers around the world, and especially those on the economic margins. His style was informal, even when conducting ceremonies, and his first act as Pope was to pay his own hotel bill. In his early gestures, like washing the feet of the elderly and prisoners, he showed desire for his priests to be closer to the disadvantaged. He spoke out for the protection of migrants and refugees, laying a wreath on the waters where so many died on their perilous journeys. He travelled widely, drawing energy from the crowds. In Brazil, 3 million gathered on Copacabana Beach. And in the Philippines, he broke records for the world's largest mass, as 6 million turned out to join him. He linked economic inequality to the environment. In a video launching a papal encyclical, he said climate change amounted to rich countries inflicting damage on poor ones.
The Pope of the Holy See!
In 2015, he became the first pope to address the US Congress.
I am most grateful for your invitation
telling the world's richest nation to take care of Mother Earth.
God bless America.
He apologised for the scandal of sexual abuse of children by priests. His words here spoken by a translator.
God weeps. For the sexual abuse of children.
On a visit to Ireland, the first by a pope in almost 40 years, he apologised to victims at almost every event, but scandals continued to emerge. His papacy marked something of a change of tone on the subject of homosexuality, early on remarking, "Who am I to judge?" when talking about a gay bishop. But some progressives argue that in practical terms, the Vatican's stance and the Church's teachings have changed little. Even so, conservative Catholics viewed him with suspicion. But in some ways, he was as traditional as Pope John Paul II, whom he made a saint. And he had very conservative views on abortion, contraception, surrogacy and gender reassignment. His style of papacy, though, couldn't have been more different to his immediate predecessor, Benedict XVI, whose funeral he presided over. Through the scores of cardinals from the developing world he appointed, he changed the complexion of the church hierarchy, consolidating a shift in the centre of gravity of Catholicism away from Europe, where it was in decline, toward Latin America, Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. In recent years, Pope Francis was beset by health issues, most noticeably affecting his mobility, but he found it hard to pare down his busy schedule.
Buona domenica a tutti.
He was, above all, a pastoral pope, a man of humility who preferred the fellowship of ordinary believers to the trappings of ecclesiastical status and power.
That was Aline McBool there, reflecting on the life of Pope Francis, who's died at the age of 88. And since the news was announced just a few hours ago, people have been heading towards St. Peter's Square, towards the Vatican. And there, Sofia Petitza is standing by for us. What have people been saying to you there, Sofia?
Well, Luis, we've been speaking to people from lots of different countries who have gathered here just outside St. Peter's Basilica. We spoke to people from Denmark, from India, from South Africa, and they talk about being in shock about the news of Pope Francis dying. And that's because just yesterday, about 24 hours ago, Pope Francis was seen here outside St. Peter's Basilica giving his yearly Easter address to Catholics around the world, Easter being a really important date in the Catholic calendar. And we can speak to two people who are studying here in Rome. Hello.
Hello.
Rafael from Brazil
Yes.
and Botti from Hungary. Hello.
Nice to meet you. Hello.
Thanks for speaking to us. How did you feel when you heard the news about Pope Francis?
Well, it's kind of shock because we got the news in the morning. We were preparing to go to the parade at Trico Massimo, and then we got the news and we were like, kind of, what happened? Because just yesterday he was here during the mass, and it was kind of shocking, and so we decided to come to the Vatican to show some respect for him.
How about you?
Well, I was obviously shocked. I knew that he was sick and expected him to pass away quite soon, but it's still a shocking experience to see the leader of the church and pass away. It was very shocking.
What do you think you'll remember about Pope Francis?
Well, he lived a quite colorful life, and I think that he moved the church in the right direction, and his legacy will be, I suppose that he put a lot of effort into people inside and outside the church realize that we can communicate and help each other, and that's the most basic and important thing that he left behind, communication and giving each other a hand to help. I think he did put a lot of effort into that.
Yeah, I think it's the same. He was a very progressive pope. I'm not a very Catholic, but all my family is Catholic, but I was following from far, and I think it's everything that he said. So come here to show some respect for this pope who started, let's say, a trend in the church of a more progressive one.
You say that Pope Francis was quite progressive. Why do you think that is? What makes you say that?
Well, I think it was above everything about his opinions on gay marriage, just of the fact about his speaking about gay marriage and how the church should view that. I think it was very different from the Pope before.
Yeah.
So following from far, let's say, it was mainly in this thing, I would say.
And do you think Pope Francis, you guys are quite young, how old are you?
I'm 22.
23.
Right, so do you think Pope Francis was able to reach younger people like yourselves?
Well, it's a really hard job to reach younger people and younger generations, but I think he achieved as much as he can. He did put into a lot of effort into communicating with the younger generations, and he talked about issues that are important to the younger people, and I think that he put all of the efforts he can, and of course he won't reach billions of young people, but still he did a great job, I think.
Botti, Rafael, thank you so much for speaking to the BBC. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's something we heard from lots of people we've been speaking to here today. The fact that Pope Francis was really trying to make the Catholic Church more inclusive. Someone else told me that he was passionate about his job and that he'll be very much missed, and especially from people I've been speaking to from South America, from Puerto Rico, from El Salvador, who sort of highlighted how Pope Francis, being the first Pope from South America in centuries, meant a great deal to lots of Catholics from Latin America. And of course, Luis, this is just a sense of what's happening today at the Vatican. There will be more activity planned in the next few days, in the next few weeks. I think for now, people are just sort of taking in the news and reflecting on the life of Pope Francis. Luis.
Thank you, Sophia. Well, religious and world leaders have been paying tribute to Pope Francis. French President Emmanuel Macron described him as a man of humility on the side of the most vulnerable and the most fragile. Stephen Cottrell, the Archbishop of York, currently acting head of the Church of England, said Francis showed us how to follow Jesus and encouraged us to go and do likewise. Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof gave this tribute. With his sober way of life, acts of service and compassion, Pope Francis was a role model for many. Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, described him as a great man, a great shepherd. She added, "I had the privilege of enjoying his friendship, his advice and his teachings." And Narendra Modi said Pope Francis would be remembered as a beacon of compassion, humility and spiritual courage by millions across the world. Right, my colleagues Rich Preston, Jorge Perez are here with the very latest. Jorge, just start with you. What have you got for us?
Very early in Latin America yet, 8:10 a.m. in Argentina. We have our reaction from the spokesperson of the presidency declaring a 7-day of mourning, a whole week of mourning in Argentina. It's going to be announced by President Javier Milei in the upcoming hours, but it's already official by the spokesperson of the presidency.
And Rich?
Lewis, we're starting to see reaction coming in from African leaders. The South African President Cyril Ramaphosa says Catholics and people of all faiths are saddened today by the passing of a spiritual leader who sought to unite humanity and wished to see a world governed by fundamental human values. Earlier on, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed extended his condolences, saying, "May his legacy of compassion, humility and service to humanity continue to inspire generations to come." And Kenya's President Lewis William Ruto called the Pope's passing a big loss to the Christian world. He praised Francis's unwavering commitment to inclusivity and justice.
And just want to bring the latest communication from the Vatican as well, an update effectively on what happens now, on what happens next. It's just a short statement, so I'll just bring you that. The Vatican just communicated that. This evening, Monday, April the 21st at 8 p.m. local time, Cardinal Kevin Joseph Farrell will preside over the rite of the declaration of death and the placing of the body in the coffin. So that's 8 p.m. local time there in Vatican. Will be the declaration of death and the placing of the body in the coffin. That process itself actually simplified by Pope Francis whilst he was alive, insisting on a more simple process, one more similar to a normal burial, and in line certainly with those values that he was keen to project of humility, of a simple life and simple values. And already, just hours after his death this morning, we are seeing that legacy effectively carry on in the next stage of this process, a pared back and a slightly simplified version of what would otherwise have happened. Rich, just bring us up to date with the latest developments.
Well, Lewis, we're also seeing comments come in from the Palestinian leader, Mahmoud Abbas. Now, he has added his condolences, saying, "Today we lost a faithful friend of the Palestinian people and their legitimate rights." He went on to say that Pope Francis recognised the Palestinian state and authorised the Palestinian flag to be raised in the Vatican. Earlier on today, Israel's President, Isaac Herzog, praised Pope Francis as a man of deep faith and boundless compassion, saying he saw great importance in fostering strong ties with the Jewish world and in advancing interfaith dialogue as a path toward greater understanding and mutual respect.
Okay. Rich, thank you very much. Jorge, thank you too. We're going to speak now to Piero Schiavazzi, Professor of Vatican Geopolitics at the Link Campus, University of Rome. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. First of all, just your reflections. What stands out to you at this moment?
I met him 10 years before his election in 2003. So you can imagine how many things now pass in my mind. I would like to say to you something new respecting of all the comments of these hours. This is his legacy, in my opinion. He told me 10 years before being elected, Professor Schiavazzi, there is something new in this new millennium, the power. The power will be anonymous. The power will be anonymous. This is his legacy. He conducted a battle against all the anonymous powers in the world during these 12 years of pontificate. The second thing I would like to say to you, remind the famous musical, I met him in Argentina, okay? There is a famous British musical by Andrew Lloyd Webber, Evita. So every Argentine man or woman has grown up in the myth of Evita, even Bergoglio. Remind the words of a famous song. I couldn't stay looking out from the window, the word. I had to change. Don't keep your distance. So he didn't want to keep the distance from the people during this last month. The Pope of the hospital, the field hospital, you know his famous definition of the church. The church, in his opinion, is a field hospital. The Pope of a field hospital wanted to die in the field until the last moment, until the last Sunday. So I couldn't imagine a better death for him. I couldn't imagine a better death. And he had the death he chose until the last minute.
Piero, thank you for that. I just want to talk about some of the things that he did when he stepped out into the world, as you were alluding to there. And if you put yourself in politics, in international affairs, of course you will be criticised, and he certainly was. What do you think his achievements or his failures were in the world of that international geopolitics?
Enormous role. 135 cardinals are going to elect the new pope. Well, in 10 consistories, a consistory is when a pope elects and chose new cardinals, he has operated the largest redistribution of cardinals and power, because now, since this morning, the power in the church is in the hands of the people, of the 135 cardinals who are going to elect his successor. Well, he operated the largest redistribution of power between nations, cities, and continents. For the first time, we have 23 cardinals from Asia, electors. And for the first time in history, we have 18 cardinals from Africa. Never happened before. This is the geopolitical revolution he operated. If we today can define the church globalized, is due to the work of Pope Francis. The church has always been universal. But for the first time in its history, the church is globalized. And it's not the same thing to say universal and globalized. Universal means from Rome, from the center, from the Vatican, go everywhere. Globalized means that the future managers of the church, the future leaders. I use the term managers because it's a modern word. The managers and the leaders of the church will come from abroad. The church, maybe we could have an African or an Asian pope. And this is something totally new, never seen before in the history of the church.
Okay, Piero, we really appreciate your time. That was Piero Scaviazzi. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Thank you. Now, we've been live in the Vatican City and live across different parts of the region. We're going to head live now to Bethlehem, and we can speak to our Middle East correspondent, Yolande Nell, who's outside the Church of the Nativity. Yolande, what's happening there?
Well, Palestinian Christians have been expressing great sorrow as we've asked them for their reaction. Some of them going into the Nativity Church just behind me, built on the spot where it's believed that Jesus was born, so that they were going to pray for Pope Francis. Really, people here remember very much that he was very outspoken always about the need for peace in the Holy Land. He came on his first visit just 1 year after entering into his papal office on really a very memorable trip for people. He held a big open-air mass here in Manger Square, right next to the church, and 8,000 people gathered for that, Palestinian Christians who really came from all over the territories. But what was a kind of defining image of that visit was when he stopped by the wall on the way here that is part of Israel's West Bank barrier that blocks Bethlehem off from Jerusalem. He laid his palm on the wall and he prayed. And later his aide said that he recognized it as a symbol of conflict, as a symbol of division. And what we had heard from Pope Francis more and more recently were comments about the war in Gaza and more criticism of Israel's ongoing military offensive there. He had said that in his last message, he appealed to the warring parties for a ceasefire. And people here really sort of noted that, and many people remarked to me too how it was something they felt a message of great support and solidarity from the Pope, that he would so regularly call the priest of the Holy Family Church in Gaza City. This is where many of the hundreds of Christians in Gaza, people displaced by the war, have been sheltering there.
And Yolande, of course, we've been hearing from previous guests about when he spoke out, involved himself in politics, in international affairs, in conflicts. There is always the controversy that goes along with that.
That's right. And sometimes, on the Israeli side, there was some anger at some of the comments that were made by the Pope. But he was very careful. For example, in his last statement, he called for a ceasefire. He called on Hamas to release the remaining hostages it's holding. And really, that he said that they should come to aid of a starving people that's aspiring to a future of peace. On the Palestinian side, I spoke to the mayor of Bethlehem, a Christian himself, and he said how Pope Francis was really seen as being a friend of the Palestinian people, one of the few leaders in the world, he said, who was supporting Palestinian rights, and he hoped the next Pope would take up similar positions.
Okay. Yolande, thank you very much for that. With me here in the studio, still Rich Preston, who's keeping across the latest developments around the world for us, and Jorge Perez from BBC Mundo, because, of course, as we know, Pope Francis, the first Latin American Pope. And in the region now, it's, Argentina, it's coming up to 8:30. So whilst we've been on air, it's been quite early in the morning, but now people will be awake there and absorbing the news. What reaction have we got?
Yeah, we have been hearing reactions from other officials in Latin American governments. The foreign affairs ministers of Mexico, for example, was expressing sorrow for Pope Francis' death, and we are, of course, expecting more leaders in the region to react, because this is known as one of the most Catholic regions in the world. I was mentioning you earlier how popular Pope Francis remained despite some issues that were affecting his popularity. We were talking about corruption within religious institutions in the region. We're talking about how the church managed the situation of the sexual abuse scandals that some priests were implicated, and of course this sort of affected not only the popularity of Pope Francis in the region, but also of the Catholic Church. An example could be the same Argentina. Argentina, when Pope Francis was elected the leader of the Catholic Church, 90% of Argentinians were in support of him being named leader of the church, but last year, the last survey came to about 64% of Argentinians. It's still higher than some local leaders, but of course you can see what this means for the region and how the Latin Americans perceive Pope Francis.
Right, really interesting. Rich, let's come to you. This news broke, 3 and a bit hours ago now. Plenty of reaction around the world, obviously depending on the time zones. Talk us through the latest.
Well, Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has described him as a great man and a great shepherd. Poland's President Andrzej Duda calling him a great apostle of mercy in whom he saw the answer to the challenges of the modern world. Emmanuel Macron of France describing him as always siding with the most vulnerable and the most fragile. Spain's declared 3 days of national mourning. Lewis, in Austria, black flags will be flown from clerical and religious buildings. The Eiffel Tower is going to go dark tonight. There will be a special memorial mass in Notre Dame. We have heard from J.D. Vance, the US Vice President, who's currently on a trip to India. He said, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him." Now, it's interesting, we've touched on how the Pope intervened in controversial subjects, and he was highly critical of President Trump during his first term in office and his plans to build a border wall. When he was re-elected, Pope Francis denounced his planned migrant deportations as, quote, a major crisis that will end badly. Now, we did hear from the White House earlier on. They posted on X the message, "Rest in peace," along with photographs of the President and First Lady meeting the Pope. We've not heard anything more from any US officials since then.
Rich, thank you very much. Well, the news broke this morning, people in Rome did head towards St. Peter's Square, and we got to catch up with a couple of them. Let's take a listen.
I was sort of really shocked because I was here yesterday at Mass and I saw the Pope and he looked just so fragile, you know.
Moments of a bit of sadness and at the same time thankfulness and celebration of life.
It's a great disappointment, a great loss. A man who has innovated the church and a man who has left a great mark. And this absence causes great pain.
Great emotion, a great emptiness, yes. We will miss him.
Yesterday, he talked about all the wars in the world, Ukraine, Burma, and even Gaza. I'm so sad.
Well, we can heard some of those voices. Want to hear now from Catholic historian and author Michael Walsh. Michael, thank you very much for coming on the programme. We've got the sense there of the different emotions of people coming. Clearly the news still quite raw, just a few hours old. How do you reflect on it?
Well, this is a very, very sad day, indeed. Pope Francis had really changed our conception of the papacy, those of us who are Catholics, and in fact possibly changed the conception of the papacy around the world. He's been a powerful force, particularly for migrants, as I think has just been mentioned, and for the poor, and also for inclusivity. A lot of Catholic women think he hasn't been firm enough about the role of women in the church. One of the first things he did, which scandalized people, frankly, was on a Maundy Thursday to wash the feet of women, which no pope had done before.
And let's stick with some of those issues then. Gay rights, the role of women. How do you think he navigated it? Because clearly he was heavily criticised from both sides of the debate on both issues.
Well, yes, you can't please everybody all the time, of course. I mean, most famously, he said when tackled about, and was on a plane at the time, it was tackled about the place of gay people in the church, gays in the church, and he said, "Who am I to judge?" Which was very unlike any of his predecessors, I must say. They wouldn't have said anything like that.
And what about his handling the child sex abuse scandal that he inherited, but many felt should have gone further and done more?
Yes, I mean, it's been dragging on and on and on, hasn't it? One of the things about it, which I think is overlooked, and we all turn to the Pope in all these issues, but in fact, really it's the job of the bishops, the local church, to deal with things like that. But he did his best. I mean, I think, but he also, I think, in his local church, the Vatican, he spent some time, a good deal of effort to try and clean up the Vatican banks, which was also a source of scandal.
And let's look at how he would like to be remembered. The image that he certainly wanted to project was one of simplicity, humility, and care and concern for the most vulnerable. Do you think that is how he will be remembered?
Well, absolutely. Funnily enough, I think the most telling photograph of him is not actually as Pope, but as when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And he's there sitting on a bus with all the workers going to work. I think it's a very telling image. But of course, famously, immediately after he was elected, instead of he joined his fellow cardinals in the bus instead of taking the car that had been prepared to take them off to their lodging. I think that was, and then of course he didn't live in the rather grandiose papal apartments, but in a guest house in the Vatican grounds. All that has, I think, changed the way we think of the papacy. I don't imagine we're going to go back to the old autocratic, dictatorial type of papacy, not in the near future anyway.
Michael Walsh, thank you very much for your time. We're struggling slightly with the line at the air there, but we got to hear certainly the gist and much more than that. Thank you very much for your time. Right, let's just take a look at some of the live pictures we have available to us here. This is Notre Dame in the centre of Paris in France, with people gathering there. And now let's take a look at the flags being lowered at half-mast at the Vatican Embassy there. And Sam Harrison is now standing by for us, our correspondent in central London. Sam, just talk us through where you are there.
Afternoon, yes, we're stood outside Westminster Cathedral here. There have been several services that have already taken place this morning. We've been speaking to many people who have come to those services today. They were services which were always planned. They were in the schedule for Westminster Cathedral. But of course, people have been coming here with the new news that Pope Francis has died at the age of 88. A massively poignant and powerful moment for people to walk through these grand doors behind me to attend an Easter Monday Mass here whilst hearing the news that Pope Francis has passed away. We had over the last hour or so the flagpole just behind me, the Vatican state flag going up at half-mast there. So we've had a lot of people coming, taking photos, but generally it's just been a chance for people to come and reflect in their own personal way on the papacy of Pope Francis. We've spoken to people from around the world here this morning. A lady from Argentina told us of the immense sorrow that her country will feel at this loss, which I think speaks volumes to the type of Pope that Francis was. He was an international figure, taking international Catholicism into a globalized world. He was the first Latin American Pope and the first from outside Europe for over 1,000 years. You get a real sense of that here. We've spoken to a number of people from different nationalities who have attended those services this morning. What we'll see later in the day is a special service being put on here at Westminster Cathedral at around 5:30. Something called a Requiem Mass will take place. This invites members of the congregation, mourners here, to pray for the soul of Pope Francis. We are expecting that congregation to be much larger than what we've seen here this morning, but certainly this is just a place for people to come, to reflect, to gather, a focal point for the Catholic community here in the centre of London at Westminster Cathedral, which is the largest Roman Catholic church in England and Wales.
Okay, Sam, thank you for that. Right, in the studio with me, Rich Preston and Jorge Perez, keeping across the latest developments. And Rich, just want to bring you the latest from the Vatican that we have about the process of what happens next, which is basically saying there's a declaration of death and the placing of the body in the coffin at 8 p.m. tonight. That is the latest update from the Vatican on the logistics and what happens next. Wider than that, the reaction, what else have we got?
Well, I just want to remind you of what we heard from here in the UK earlier on today. Lewis, Prime Minister Keir Starmer said, "I join millions around the world in grieving the death of His Holiness Pope Francis. His leadership in a complex and challenging time for the world and the Church was courageous, yet always came from a place of deep humility." We also heard from the King, who of course recently met alongside the Queen, the Pope, on their visit to Italy. He said, "My wife and I were most deeply saddened to learn of the death of Pope Francis. Our heavy hearts have been somewhat eased, however, to know that His Holiness was able to share an Easter greeting with the Church and the world he served with such devotion throughout his life and ministry." Now, what's interesting, Lewis, is of course seeing the reactions that come from out with the Catholic community. Iran earlier today offered its condolences. A spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry saying, "I offer my condolences to all Christians around the world." That's from an Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman. As I say, we heard from the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas saying that Pope Francis was a great supporter of the Palestinian people. Israel's President Isaac Herzog saying that Francis saw great importance in fostering strong ties with the Jewish world. And in terms of what different countries are doing to honour Pope Francis, Spain, 3 days of national mourning there. Argentina, 7 days of national mourning. Austria is flying black flags from clerical and religious buildings. Lights will go off later today at the Eiffel Tower. And in Jerusalem on Wednesday, we heard from Yolande Nell earlier on, there will be a special memorial mass on Wednesday at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre.
Rich, thank you for that. And what about the reaction in Latin America, Jorge?
Still waiting for some of the leaders in the region to react. It's still very early in Central America. For example, in Mexico, it's still before 6 a.m. The most important came from Argentina's President Javier Milei, saying that he expressed his sorrow for what happened, recognizing that he had some differences with Pope Francis in the past, but that now he sees them as minor differences. And he was recognizing the importance of Pope Francis, not only in Argentina, but also in the region.
Jorge, thank you very much for that. Well, following the death of Pope Francis, Buckingham Palace issued a statement from King Charles and Queen Camilla. The King said, "My wife and I were most deeply saddened to learn of the death of Pope Francis. His Holiness will be remembered for his compassion, his concern for the unity of the Church, and for his tireless commitment to the common causes of all people of faith." He added, "The Queen and I remember with particular affection our meetings with His Holiness, and we were greatly moved to have been able to visit him earlier this month. We send our most heartfelt condolences and profound sympathy." So those words from the King, echoing the sentiments of so many world leaders, of course, right around the world. And we've been getting the thoughts and analysis of experts around the world as well. And a little earlier, we heard from Joel Hodge, Head of Theology at the Australian Catholic University in Brisbane.
Shock, sadness, the loss of a great spiritual man and leader. Obviously, a lot of people thought that he was improving, out of hospital and coming back to us, and seeing him at the Vatican and St. Peter's over the Easter period. So there was hope that he was on the path of recovery. So a lot of surprise and just sadness at the loss of such a great leader and man of faith.
And just talk us through that man of faith. He was a man of firsts in so many ways in that role.
He was indeed a man, firstly, who became Pope not after the death of a Pope, but after the resignation of a Pope. So that was quite extraordinary in and of itself. And then the first South American, Latin American pontiff and Argentinian, a man with an Italian background and a grasp of Italian, of course, so he knew the Italian culture and could work with that context and environment, but coming very much from the outside of that too. So, and with that different perspective, the perspective of the Latin American world and that great concern for the poor, for the migrant, his family being a family of migrants, but also, yes, a great man of spiritual insight and depth. He was the first Jesuit to be a pope from that great religious congregation that St. Ignatius of Loyola started 500 years ago. And he brought that spiritual depth and framework to the papacy, particularly in terms of discerning the church's way forward around governance and other matters. So he brought so many beautiful gifts to the church, which are going to be missed.
Joel, we've had tributes, of course, from around the world. I just want to read this one, and I'll just get your thoughts off the back of it, if I may, because I'm sure they will reflect the feelings of so many. This is from the former Archbishop of Canterbury here in the UK, Justin Welby, saying this: "It is with a deep sense of personal sadness that I mourn the death of my friend, His Holiness Pope Francis. With our Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, along with the global church and many more around the world, I'm filled with a great sense of loss. He was a Pope who spoke not just to the Catholic Church, but far beyond it. His leadership was felt powerfully among us in the Anglican community. From the very first days of his papacy, he was an example of humility. He constantly reminded us of the importance of serving the poor, always standing with those who face persecution and hardship. During my time as Archbishop of Canterbury, it was a great privilege to work with him in peace building, not least in South Sudan. Over the years, he became a friend, and I will miss him deeply. For his commitment to walking together as Roman Catholics and Anglicans, for his vision, passion, for working for ever greater reconciliation and unity between all Christian denominations, I am profoundly grateful. I give thanks to God for his life and his faithful servant of Christ. May he rest in peace and rise in glory." I just want to pick up that one line there where he says he was a representative of the church, of course, but, quote, far beyond it. And that idea of having a presence right around the world, expanding out beyond Catholic and Christian communities.
He was a singular global figure. He drew the attention of just so many people in not only what he said, but how he said it, what he did, the manner of his life, He was a great exemplar of the Christian life, of a great servant of the church. He loved Jesus. He loved the way of Jesus, that way of love, and he just exemplified that in his simplicity and in his humility, and exemplified by his name, Francis, taking that name which no other pope had taken before, in honor of Francis of Assisi, in giving that way of simplicity, of humility, of poverty, of dedication to Jesus and the church. And that resonated not only with Catholics, but with so many Christians and so many non-Christians. And he was a man that reached out to people of other churches and of other faiths. That was very much part of his agenda, so to speak, or his charism, and particularly to the Muslim world. He went just recently to Indonesia, to our part of the world, and visited, the most populous Muslim country in the world. And that visit was such a striking visit, I think, and a great visit of peace, of interfaith relations. And he did that with other Muslim leaders too. So he will be very much missed, not just by Catholics, but by other Christians and non-Catholics around the world, just by the kind of things that he exemplified, the type of person he was. The world is poorer for the loss.
We listened there to Joel Hodge with his reflections. Just want to take you live to Buenos Aires now. Of course, Pope Francis was the first Latin American leader of the Roman Catholic Church, a hugely significant appointment back in 2013 when it was made, and still hugely significant right now. We can speak to BBC Mundo's correspondent in Buenos Aires, Veronica Smink. Veronica, just talk us through the reaction there.
Well, people woke up this morning, are still waking up. It's very early here, to the news, and absolutely shocked. I mean, it's just weeks ago that people were praying for his health. He seemed to be so close to death so many times, and yet he survived. People saw images of him yesterday during Easter Sunday, and I don't think anybody expected this news today.
And how do you think, when people do wake up and fully absorb the news, what are the reflections and what will the legacies be for the region?
Well, I've already heard, people saying, on the one hand, as you were just mentioning, he was a simple and humble man. He lived as he preached. And many people, say he tried to unite the world. He did so much good. There are also people that have been much more harsh, especially on social media, because one of the big things that people ask today is, why did he never visit his country? He left in March 2013 and never returned. Why? He visited 4 countries that border Argentina. Why did he never return home? And many people are really hurt by this.
And do you think that will damage the reputation in the region?
I think it's a particular Argentine thing. The Pew Research Center actually did a survey about this, and the country in Latin America where the opinions worsened about Francis was in Argentina. There was a 3%, bad opinions back in 2013, and last year it went up to 30. I think people are really hurt, but also I think Pope Francis got caught up in a political rift that's a decades-long political rift. Many people assumed he was a Peronist. He denied this, but many people did assume this. And I talked to a close friend of his, and he said that he could feel a certain hostility against him. But on the other hand, he also knew that people adored him, especially in the periphery, and humble people, poor people. And he did say, this friend, that Pope Francis did intend to visit. He thought that he intended this for the end of his papacy, but evidently he wasn't able to do so.
Okay, Veronica Smink, thank you very much for that. And as Veronica was talking there, we were seeing those pictures, that live feed coming in to us here of from Buenos Aires Cathedral for a mass in tribute to Pope Francis. Just want to bring in my colleague Rich Preston, who's with me here. Rich.
Just in the last few moments, Lewis, we've had a statement from the former President Joe Biden on the passing of Pope Francis. He says, "It is with great sadness that Jill and I learned of the passing of His Holiness Pope Francis. He was unlike any who came before him. Pope Francis will be remembered as one of the most consequential leaders of our time, and I'm better for having known him. For decades, he served the most vulnerable across Argentina, and his mission of serving the poor never ceased. The statement goes on to say, as Pope, he was a loving pastor and challenging teacher who reached out to different faiths. He commanded us to fight for peace and protect our planet from a climate crisis. He advocated for the voiceless and powerless. He made all feel welcome and seen by the Church, promoted equality and an end to poverty and suffering across the globe. Above all, he was a pope for everyone. He was the people's pope, a light of faith, hope and love. And just to remind you, when it comes to the current administration, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, earlier on today said, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world who loved him." The White House has just posted a simple message on X, "Rest in peace," alongside a photo of the President and First Lady with the Pope and the Vice President with the Pope. We've not heard anything further yet from President Trump or the White House.
Rich, thank you very much for that. Yeah, we will keep an eye on that. Of course, still relatively early there in the US, but Rich Preston, they're keeping across the latest reaction we are getting from America. We're going to speak now to Father Rocco D'Ambrosio, Professor of Political Philosophy and Ethics at Political Gordon University. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. First of all, just your thoughts of the news.
Thank you to you all. Good morning.
Just what your reflections.
My reflection about the Pope Francis in this moment is a big thanks to our Lord, because he has been a really big gift for the Church, because he was able to recall all the issues of the Council of the Vatican II and to propose to the Church, to the world, in a very particular way, with the way he was, and Latino American priest and bishop, and a great passion, a great empathy in understanding what people, especially the poor and people far from the normal life, to understand the needs, and in the same moment to try to answer to the needs, and to bring the Church to listen to the poor and to listen especially issues of this very delicate historical moment.
And he was a Pope of firsts in many ways. We were just hearing about the links to Latin America, the first Pope from Latin America, also the first Jesuit. What influence did that have?
Oh, the influences are really combined, because for the Latino America side, what I said, the passion, the empathy for the poor and the poorest situation in the world. And on the other hand, as a Jesuit, the capacity to read the situation with a big intelligence and wisdom, to read the reasons of the social, religious, cultural situation, especially the worst of them. And second, to bring the situation inside, because a word used so often by Pope Francis was discernment. Is typical of the Jesuit tradition. The discernment is the ability to read the personal stories and the social and global stories under the light of God. Just to ask to myself, to ourselves, what God wants now from us. This is the discernment, to understand where the history is going and what God wants about it.
Father Rocco D'Ambrosio, thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, with me here in the studio, Rich Preston still, Jorge Perez still. Rich, just reflect again from you were just bringing us from the US and any other updates that you have there.
That's right, Lewis. A statement from the former President Joe Biden saying it's with great sadness Jill and I learned of the passing of His Holiness Pope Francis. He commanded us to fight for peace, protect our planet from a climate crisis, advocated for the voiceless and powerless, made all feel welcome and seen by the Church, and promoted equality and an end to poverty and suffering. From the current administration, J.D. Vance, the Vice President, said, "My heart goes out to the millions of Christians all over the world." Nothing official from the White House other than a simple post on X saying rest in peace. In the last few moments, the Dalai Lama has said Pope Francis dedicated himself to the service of others.
Jorge, just briefly, reaction from Latin America.
The most important one coming from Pope Francis' country, Argentina. Argentina is declaring 7 days of mourning, a whole week mourning. Pope Francis, President Milei was also expressing its sorrow for his passing, remarking that they both had minor differences now, but of course in the past it was a conflictive relationship between Milei and the Pope. Now Milei says those differences seems to be minor, highlighting the importance this man had for not only Argentina but also for the whole region.
Jorge Perez from BBC Mundo, thank you. Rich Preston, thank you very much for bringing us the very latest over the last few hours. So I just want to bring you right up to date with the reaction to the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88. It was just after 7:30 this morning when Pope Francis died. This was after making a public appearance just at the weekend. He died on Easter Monday, of course, that hugely poignant and significant time in the Catholic Christian calendar. The Vatican made the announcement just a couple of hours after that, and since then reaction has been pouring in from religious leaders, from world leaders, from millions of people around the world, reflecting on the role, the legacy and their memories of Pope Francis. There is plenty more coverage continuing here on BBC News, but for the moment, I'm Lewis Vaughan-Jones. This is BBC News.